The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on Jake Morrison's weathered face as he guided his horse through the main street of Red Creek. Dust swirled around the hooves of his bay mare, creating small cyclones that danced briefly before settling back onto the hard-packed earth. The town looked much the same as it had 6 months ago, weathered wooden buildings leaning slightly with age, hitching posts worn smooth by countless rains, and the ever-present smell of horse sweat mixed with the distant aroma of cooking food and tobacco smoke. Jake pulled his hat lower over his eyes, more from habit than necessity. At 42, he'd spent most of his adult life under this same relentless sun, working cattle on his small ranch 30 miles north. Today's trip to town was purely practical. He needed ammunition, coffee, and salt pork to last him through the next month. The sooner he completed his business, the sooner he could return to the blessed solitude of his homestead. Red Creek's main street bustled with its usual mix of cowboys, merchants, and drifters. Women in long dresses hurried between the general store and the boarding house, their bonnets providing precious shade. Men gathered outside the barber shop, discussing cattle prices and the weather, with the slow, deliberate cadence of those who had nowhere else to be. Jake dismounted in front of Henderson's general store, his boots hitting the wooden boardwalk with a solid thunk. He tied his horse's reins to the hitching post and patted the mare's neck. "Easy, girl. Won't be long now." As he turned toward the store's entrance, a sound made him pause. A baby's cry, thin and desperate in the hot air. Jake frowned, looking around for the source. The cry came again, this time accompanied by what sounded like a woman's soothing voice, speaking in a language he didn't recognize. Following the sound, Jake walked past the general store toward the Golden Dollar Saloon. The establishment stood at the corner of Main Street and what the locals generously called Second Avenue, though it was little more than a wide alley. The saloon's paint was peeling, and its batwing doors hung slightly askew, giving the building a tired, defeated appearance. It was there, in the narrow space between the saloon and the adjacent building, that Jake saw her. A young woman sat on the ground, her back against the saloon's weathered wall. She couldn't have been more than 25, with long black hair that had escaped from what had once been a neat bun. Her dress, though dusty and wrinkled, suggested she had once known better circumstances. In her arms, she held an infant who couldn't have been more than a few months old. What made Jake's blood run cold was the heavy iron shackle around her ankle, connected by a short chain to a metal ring bolted into the saloon's foundation. The woman looked up as Jake approached, and he saw fear flash across her delicate features. Her eyes were dark and almond-shaped, suggesting Chinese heritage, though she spoke with no accent when she whispered, "Please, don't hurt us." Jake slowly removed his hat, keeping his movements gentle and non-threatening. "Ma'am, I'm not going to hurt you. My name's Jake Morrison." He crouched down several feet away, putting himself at her eye level. "What's your name?" "Sarah," she replied softly, adjusting the baby in her arms. "Sarah Chen. That's a fine boy you've got there, Sarah." "What's his name?" "Tommy. His name is Tommy." She studied Jake's face carefully, as if trying to determine whether he was friend or foe. Jake's gaze moved to the shackle around her ankle, then back to her face. "How long have you been chained here?" Sarah's voice was barely audible above the sounds of the street. 3 weeks now, maybe 4. The days, they all seemed the same. A fury unlike anything Jake had felt in years began building in his chest. He'd seen cruelty in his time, during the war, in cattle towns, even in his own troubled past. But this was different. This was a young mother with a baby, treated like an animal. "Who did this to you?" Before Sarah could answer, the saloon's batwing doors swung open with a violent crash. A large man in a stained vest emerged, his face red with anger and alcohol. Behind him came 2 other men, both wearing gun belts and the hard expressions of those accustomed to violence. "Get away from her, stranger," the large man commanded, his hand resting on the grip of his pistol. "That there's private property." Jake rose slowly, his own hand instinctively moving toward his weapon. "Private property? That's a woman and child, not livestock." The man laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Name's Clarence Pike, and I own this establishment. That Chinese girl owes me money, a lot of money. Until she pays what her dead husband borrowed, she works for me." His eyes glittered dangerously. "Now move along, cowboy, before this becomes your problem too." Jake looked back at Sarah, who was holding her baby closer and looking between the 2 men with terror in her eyes. Everything in his practical mind told him to walk away, to buy his supplies and ride back to his ranch where life was simple. and complications were limited to sick cattle and broken fences. But as he looked into Sarah's eyes, Jake Morrison knew he couldn't walk away. Some lines, once crossed, changed a man forever, and some fights, no matter how dangerous, were worth having. I reckon it already is my problem, Pike. And the tension in the narrow alley crackled like lightning before a summer storm. Clarence Pike's face darkened as he processed Jake's words, while his two associates spread out slightly, their hands hovering near their weapons. The afternoon sun cast harsh shadows that seemed to divide the space between the men like battle lines drawn in dust and conscience. "You don't know what you're getting into, stranger," Pike said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "This ain't some dime novel where the hero rides in and saves the day. This here's business, plain and simple." Jake kept his stance relaxed but ready, years of experience having taught him that the most dangerous moments often appeared deceptively calm. "What kind of business involves chaining a woman with a baby to a wall?" "The kind that keeps order in this town," Pike replied, spitting into the dirt. "See, Sarah's husband, a no-account gambler named David Chen, owed me near $300 when he got himself shot in a card game 2 months back. Now, the way I see it, debts don't die with the debtor. They pass on to the family." Sarah's voice was quiet, but clear. "David wasn't a gambler when I married him. He was a good man, a hard worker, but when he lost his job at the mine, he—" She trailed off, looking down at little Tommy, who had begun to fuss in her arms. "Got desperate," Jake finished for her, understanding the story all too well. He'd seen it play out in dozens of frontier towns. Good men pushed to bad decisions by circumstance and desperation. Pike nodded with mock sympathy. "Exactly. And when desperation met my poker table, well, let's just say David Chen wasn't as good at cards as he thought he was. $300 might as well have been $3,000 for a man like him." "So you decided to enslave his wife?" Jake's voice carried a hardness that made Pike's associates shift nervously. "Enslave's a harsh word, Cowboy. I prefer to think of it as employment with incentives to stay." Pike's laugh was cruel. "She works off the debt-serving, drinks, cleaning, and whatever else needs doing. The chain's just to make sure she doesn't run off before paying what's owed." Jake looked around the alley, noting how it was positioned, visible from the main street, but tucked away enough that most decent folks would avoid looking too closely. "And the good people of Red Creek just let this happen?" One of Pike's men, a thin fellow with a scraggly beard, spoke up. "Ain't nobody's business but Mr. Pike's. Sheriff Kowalski done looked into it and said it's all legal-like. Contract debt fair and square." "Contract debt." Jake repeated the words slowly, as if tasting something bitter. "Show me this contract." Pike's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Don't need to show you nothing, stranger, but since you're so interested—" He reached into his vest pocket and produced a wrinkled piece of paper. One David Chen, in front of witnesses, agreed to these terms. His signature, his debt, his family's responsibility. Jake took the document and examined it carefully. The handwriting was shaky, desperate, and the terms were harsh beyond reason. 20% interest compounding weekly, collateral including all family assets and services. It was legal enough to hold up in a frontier court, especially with a corrupt sheriff's backing. "This is a death sentence disguised as a contract," Jake said, handing the paper back. "That's business," Pike replied with a shrug. "Now you've had your look and your say. Time for you to move along before my patience runs out." Sarah struggled to stand, the chain around her ankle limiting her movement. "Please," she said, looking directly at Jake. "I don't expect you to help us. You don't even know us. But Tommy, he hasn't done anything wrong. He's just a baby. If something could be arranged for him, somewhere safe." The desperation in her voice hit Jake like a physical blow. Here was a woman who had given up hope for herself, but still fought for her child. It reminded him painfully of another woman, another time, another failure to act when action was needed. Jake's jaw tightened as memories he'd spent years trying to forget came flooding back. His sister Mary, barely 18, trapped in a similar situation in Kansas. His own cowardice in walking away, telling himself it wasn't his fight. The telegram that came 6 months later, informing him of her death. "No," Jake said quietly but with absolute conviction. "No, I don't think I'll be moving along just yet." Pike's patience finally snapped. "Boys, I think this cowboy needs some help finding his way out of town." The two associates moved forward, but Jake's voice stopped them cold. "Before you do something you'll regret, you might want to know who you're dealing with." His hand moved to rest on his gun grip, and something in his stance, the practiced ease, the absolute stillness, gave them pause. "Jake Morrison, late of the Arizona Rangers. I've killed men before, and I'll do it again if pushed." His voice was conversational, matter-of-fact, which somehow made it more chilling than any threat. "Now, Mr. Pike, let's discuss the real terms of this situation." Pike's face had gone pale beneath his tan. The Arizona Rangers had a reputation throughout the territory, hard men who dealt with hard problems. Even a former ranger was not someone to take lightly. What terms?" Pike stammered. "Simple. You release Mrs. Chen and her boy. I'll pay her husband's debt at the original amount, not your inflated interest. That's nearly $300. I'm aware of that." Jake's voice remained steady, though inwardly he was calculating rapidly. $300 was most of his savings, money he'd planned to use for improvements to his ranch. But some things mattered more than comfort or financial security. Pike licked his lips nervously. "And if I refuse?" Jake's smile was colder than a winter morning. "Then we settle this the old-fashioned way. Your choice, Pike, business or bullets." The alley fell silent, except for the distant sounds of the town going about its daily routine. Horses clopping down Main Street, voices calling out greetings, the creak of wagon wheels. Sarah held her breath, clutching Tommy close, while Pike weighed his options. Finally, Pike nodded slowly. "300. Cash. Right now." "I'll need to visit the bank first," Jake replied. "But you have my word. And how do I know your word's worth anything?" Jake's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes made Pike take a step backward. "Because, Mr. Pike, unlike some folks, I've never chained a woman and baby to a wall. My word's about the only thing I've got left that's worth keeping." The Red Creek Bank occupied a corner building on Main Street, its brick facade a testament to the town's aspirations of permanence in an otherwise transient world. Jake pushed through the heavy wooden door, the cool interior providing blessed relief from the Arizona heat. Behind him, he could feel the weight of curious stares from townspeople who had witnessed the confrontation in the alley. Word traveled fast in a small town, and Jake could already hear the whispered conversations following in his wake. "That's the stranger who faced down Pike. Heard he used to be a ranger. Fool's gonna get himself killed over some Chinese girl." The bank president, a nervous man named Whitmore with thinning hair and wire-rimmed spectacles, looked up from his desk with barely concealed anxiety. "Mr. Morrison, Jake Morrison, I need to withdraw $300 from my account." Whitmore's eyebrows shot up. "300? That's quite a substantial withdrawal, Mr. Morrison. Might I ask what for?" "Personal business," Jake replied curtly, not in the mood for small talk or explanations. As Whitmore scurried to prepare the transaction, Jake found himself questioning his own sanity. $300 represented 2 years of careful saving, money he'd planned to use for expanding his herd or improving his ranch buildings. Now he was about to hand it over to a man like Pike, for a woman he'd known for all of 30 minutes. But every time doubt crept into his mind, he saw Sarah's face again. The fear in her eyes, the protective way she held her baby, the quiet dignity she maintained even in her desperate circumstances. More than that, he saw Mary's face, remembered the sister he'd failed to save because he'd convinced himself it wasn't his responsibility. "Here we are, Mr. Morrison," Whitmore said, counting out the bills with practiced efficiency. $300 exactly. I do hope everything is satisfactory." Jake pocketed the money and tipped his hat. "Much obliged." The walk back to the Golden Dollar Saloon felt like the longest 30 yards of Jake's life. A small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity, concern, and the morbid fascination that drew people to witness potential violence. Sarah remained chained in the alley, but Jake noticed that someone, probably one of the saloon girls, had brought her a cup of water and a small piece of bread. Pike was waiting with his 2 associates, but Jake also noticed that Sheriff Kowalski had arrived, a heavy-set man with a badge that looked too small for his barrel chest and eyes, that held the calculating look of someone always weighing personal advantage. "Ah, Mr. Morrison," Pike said with false joviality, "I was beginning to think you'd reconsidered our arrangement." "I gave my word," Jake replied simply, pulling the money from his pocket. $300, as agreed. Pike's eyes gleamed with avarice as he counted the bills twice, then handed them to one of his men for a third count. "Excellent, Sheriff, you're here as a witness. This transaction settles all debts between myself and the Chen family. Sheriff Kowalski nodded, though his expression suggested he found the whole affair distasteful. I'll make note of it in my records. Jake knelt beside Sarah and examined the shackle around her ankle. The iron was heavy and the lock substantial, but not beyond his capabilities. Pike, I'll need the key. Of course. Pike produced a small iron key from his vest pocket, but as Jake reached for it, the saloon owner pulled it back slightly. Just one more thing, Morrison. This transaction frees Mrs. Chen from her debts, but it doesn't give her any special protection. Red Creek can be a dangerous place for a woman alone with a child, especially one of mixed heritage. Accidents happen. The threat was clear, and Jake felt his temper flare. Are you suggesting that Mrs. Chen might face some kind of danger? Pike's smile was oily. I'm simply pointing out the realities of frontier life. A woman needs protection, security. Perhaps Mrs. Chen might reconsider my generous offer of employment, without the chain, of course, room, board and protection in exchange for her services. Sarah's voice was quiet but firm. I would rather face whatever dangers wait outside than accept your protection, Mr. Pike. Jake admired her courage, even as he worried about her safety. Pike's threat wasn't idle. He had the sheriff in his pocket, and enough men to make life very difficult for anyone who crossed him. But there was something else in Sarah's voice, a strength that suggested she wasn't as helpless as she might appear. Mrs. Chen won't be needing your protection, Jake said, taking the key from Pike's reluctant fingers. She'll be leaving Red Creek today. Oh? And where exactly will she go? She's got no money, no family that I know of, and a baby to care for. The desert's not forgiving to folks in her situation. Jake unlocked the shackle, the metal falling away with a satisfying clank. Sarah rubbed her ankle, wincing at the raw skin where the iron had chafed. That's her decision to make, not yours. As Sarah struggled to stand, her legs weak from weeks of limited movement, Jake offered his arm for support. She hesitated for a moment, then accepted his help, rising with as much dignity as she could muster. Thank you, she said quietly. I don't know how I can ever repay you. No need for repayment, Jake replied. Just seeing you free is payment enough. Sheriff Kowalski stepped forward, his expression uncomfortable. Now, Mrs. Chen, I hope you understand that while your debt is settled, you're still a stranger in this town. If you're planning to stay, you'll need to register with my office and— She won't be staying, Jake interrupted. Mrs. Chen, do you have somewhere you can go, family, friends? Sarah adjusted Tommy in her arms, the baby having fallen asleep during the commotion. My sister lives in Sacramento. She married a merchant there. I have her address, but— She looked down at her worn dress and empty hands. I have nothing. No money for passage, no supplies for the journey. The crowd that had gathered began to murmur among themselves. Jake heard fragments of conversation, some sympathetic, others less so. The Chinese weren't welcome in many frontier towns, and a woman traveling alone with a baby would face dangers beyond Pike's threats. I'll take you to Sacramento, Jake said, the words coming out before he'd fully considered their implications. Sarah's eyes widened. You— What? But you don't even know me. Why would you do such a thing? Jake looked into her face, seeing confusion, hope, and lingering fear all mixed together. Because it's the right thing to do, Mrs. Chen. Sometimes that's reason enough. Pike laughed harshly. You're a fool, Morrison. You think this ends here? You think I'll just let you ride out of town with $300 of my dollars and the girl who owes me more than money can repay? The debt is settled, Jake replied calmly. You have your money, and Mrs. Chen has her freedom. As for the rest of your meaning, I suggest you speak more carefully. The tension in the air was palpable. Pike's men shifted nervously, hands near their weapons, while the gathered crowd sensed that violence might erupt at any moment. Sarah pressed closer to Jake, instinctively seeking protection for herself and her child. Sheriff Kowalski cleared his throat. Well then, if the debt is settled and no laws have been broken, I suppose everyone can go about their business. Mrs. Chen is free to leave town whenever she chooses. Pike's face was flushed with anger, but he nodded curtly. Of course, Sheriff, though I do hope Mr. Morrison and Mrs. Chen have a safe journey. Jake met Pike's stare without flinching. I'm sure we will. After all, what could happen to a former Arizona Ranger and a woman under his protection? The reminder of Jake's past service had its intended effect. Pike's expression softened slightly, not from any sudden attack of conscience, but from the practical consideration that Rangers, even former ones, had friends and connections throughout the territory. "Well then," Pike said with forced cheerfulness, "I suppose this concludes our business. Good day to you all." As Pike and his men retreated into the saloon and the crowd began to disperse, Jake found himself alone in the alley with Sarah and Tommy. The enormity of what he'd just committed to began to sink in. A journey of several hundred miles through dangerous territory with a woman and infant he barely knew, pursued by enemies who wouldn't hesitate to kill them all. But as Sarah looked up at him with tears of gratitude in her eyes, Jake Morrison knew he'd made the right choice, whatever the cost might be. Within 2 hours of Sarah's liberation, Jake had transformed from a solitary rancher into the unlikely protector of a small family. The urgency of their situation became clear when one of Pike's men was spotted lingering near Henderson's general store, clearly keeping watch on their preparations to leave town. "We need to move quickly," Jake told Sarah as they stood outside the store, Tommy fussing quietly in her arms. Pike's not the type to let things lie, especially when he thinks he's been made to look foolish in front of the whole town. Sarah nodded, adjusting her grip on the baby. She had changed into a more practical traveling dress, a purchase Jake had quietly arranged with Mrs. Henderson while Sarah waited outside. The store owner's wife, a practical woman with sharp eyes and a soft heart, had also provided a collection of baby supplies and women's necessities without asking uncomfortable questions. "I still can't believe you're doing this," Sarah said softly. "Helping strangers isn't exactly common in places like Red Creek." Jake finished loading supplies into his saddlebags, his movements efficient and practiced. Maybe that's exactly why it needs doing. The conversation was interrupted by the approach of Dr. Marcus Webb, Red Creek's only physician, and one of the few educated men in town. Webb was in his 50s, with graying hair and the tired eyes of a man who had seen too much suffering with too few resources to help. "Mr. Morrison," Dr. Webb said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't being overheard, "might I have a word?" Jake stepped aside with the doctor, while Sarah remained with the horses. "What is it, Doc?" "I treated Mrs. Chen several times during her confinement. Malnutrition, exhaustion, and some injuries that I suspect weren't accidental." Webb's expression was grim. "She's stronger than she looks, but she's been through hell. The baby too. He's underweight and needs proper nutrition. Are they strong enough for travel?" "They'll have to be," Webb replied pragmatically, "because staying here isn't an option. Pike's been drinking since you left the bank, and his talk is getting uglier by the hour. Something about reclaiming his property and teaching uppity strangers about respect." Jake's jaw tightened. "How long do we have?" "Not long. Pike's talking about waiting until dark, then settling accounts his own way. Sheriff Kowalski's conveniently decided he needs to visit his sister in the next town over. Won't be back until tomorrow." The doctor reached into his medical bag and produced a small bottle of medicine and a pouch of what looked like herbs. "Laudanum for the baby if he becomes colicky during travel. The herbs are for Mrs. Chen. Make them into tea. They'll help with her strength and milk production." Jake pocketed the medicine gratefully. "Much obliged, Doc. What do I owe you?" "Nothing. Just get them out of here safely." Dr. Webb glanced toward the saloon where sounds of rough laughter were growing louder. "And Mr. Morrison, be careful. Pike's got more friends than just the 2 men you've seen. There are others who might be willing to ride after you for the right price." As Dr. Webb walked away, Jake felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. He'd committed to protecting Sarah and Tommy, but the reality of that commitment was becoming clearer by the moment. This wouldn't be a simple escort to Sacramento. It would be a running battle across hundreds of miles of dangerous territory. Sarah approached, having overheard part of the conversation. "We should leave now, shouldn't we?" "Yes," Jake replied, checking his rifle one final time. "Can you ride? I mean, really ride, not just sit on a horse?" A small smile played at the corners of Sarah's mouth, the first genuine smile Jake had seen from her. "My father was a cavalry scout before he died. He taught me to ride before I learned to walk properly, and I can shoot too, if necessary." Jake felt a surge of relief. A woman who could ride and shoot would be a partner, not just a burden to protect. "Good. We'll need every advantage we can get." He had purchased a gentle mare for Sarah from the livery stable, a horse known for her steady temperament and sure footing. For Tommy, Mrs. Henderson had provided a specially modified saddlebag that could serve as a makeshift cradle, padded with soft blankets and designed to keep the baby secure during travel. As they prepared to mount up, Sarah touched Jake's arm. "Before we leave, I need you to know something. My husband, David. He wasn't the man you probably think he was. Jake paused, sensing this was important. What do you mean? When I said he wasn't a gambler when I married him, I was telling the truth. But there's more to the story. Sarah's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. David was half Chinese like me. His father was a railroad worker. His mother was Irish. We met in California, where such things were more accepted. When we came here, David tried to pass for white. The pressure of pretending to be someone he wasn't. The constant fear of being discovered. It changed him. Jake nodded, understanding more than she might have expected. The gambling was an escape. Yes, and when he lost, when Pike's men came calling for payment, David thought he could win it back. He kept playing, kept losing, until, Sarah's voice broke slightly, until he owed so much that even his life wasn't enough collateral. That's when Pike suggested you as security for the debt. Sarah's expression hardened. Pike suggested more than that. He suggested that a woman of my mixed heritage might be useful in more ways than just serving drinks and cleaning floors. David refused, of course. That's when the poker game turned violent. Jake felt his anger at Pike intensify, but also a new respect for David Chen. Whatever his weaknesses as a gambler, he had died protecting his wife's honor. I'm sorry for your loss, Sarah, and I'm sorry for what you've endured. I'm telling you this because our journey to Sacramento won't be easy. People will make assumptions about us traveling together, a white man and a Chinese woman. There will be questions, suspicions, maybe worse. Jake mounted his horse and extended his hand to help Sarah up. Let them think what they want. We know the truth, and that's enough. As Sarah settled into her saddle with Tommy secured in his makeshift cradle, Jake took one last look at Red Creek. The town that had seemed so ordinary when he'd ridden in that morning now felt oppressive and dangerous. Somewhere behind those weathered buildings, Pike was gathering his forces for pursuit. Ready? Jake asked. Sarah straightened in her saddle, and Jake saw steel in her spine that hadn't been there when she was chained to the saloon wall. Ready. They rode out of Red Creek as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, their horses' hooves raising small clouds of dust that glittered in the golden light. Behind them, the town grew smaller, but Jake knew their troubles were just beginning. The road to Sacramento stretched ahead, hundreds of miles through desert and mountains, through towns where strangers were viewed with suspicion and mixed-race families faced outright hostility. There would be river crossings and mountain passes, supply problems and weather delays, and always the threat of Pike's men somewhere behind them. But as Jake glanced over at Sarah, seeing the determination in her profile and the protective way she checked on Tommy, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: purpose. For the first time since leaving the Rangers, he was fighting for something that mattered, protecting someone who deserved protection. The road ahead was dangerous and uncertain, but Jake Morrison had finally found something worth the risk. 3 days out from Red Creek, the landscape had transformed from desert scrub to the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. Jake had pushed them hard, taking lesser-known trails that added miles to their journey, but kept them away from the main roads where Pike's men were most likely to search. Sarah had proven herself as capable as she'd claimed. She rode without complaint, helped make camp efficiently, and kept Tommy calm during the long hours in the saddle. They had stopped to rest at a natural spring in a place the locals called Devil's Canyon, a narrow gorge with steep walls that offered both water and defensible positions. Jake had chosen the spot carefully. If trouble found them here, at least they wouldn't be caught in the open. Sarah was nursing Tommy in the shade of a large boulder, while Jake watered the horses, when the sound of approaching riders echoed off the canyon walls. Jake's hand moved instinctively to his rifle as he counted the hoofbeats. At least 6 horses, maybe more. Sarah, he called quietly, take Tommy and get behind those rocks. Stay low and don't make a sound unless I tell you to. Sarah moved quickly but calmly, gathering their supplies with practiced efficiency. Jake had taught her over the past 3 days that panic was a luxury they couldn't afford, and she had learned the lesson well. The riders appeared at the mouth of the canyon as Jake positioned himself behind a fallen log with a clear view of the approaches. Pike led the group, his face red with heat and anger, flanked by his usual 2 associates, plus 3 other men Jake didn't recognize, probably hired guns brought in from other towns. "Morrison!" Pike's voice boomed off the canyon walls. "I know you're in there, time to settle this like men." Jake remained silent, studying the terrain and his options. Devil's Canyon had steep walls, but several routes out if you knew where to look. More importantly, the narrow entrance created a bottleneck that limited how many men could approach at once. "You cost me money and reputation, Morrison," Pike continued, spurring his horse closer. "That Chinese whore belongs to me, and I aim to collect what's mine." That was enough to make Jake's blood boil, but he forced himself to remain calm. Anger would get them all killed. "Pike," he called back, "Mrs. Chen's debt was paid in full. You got your money, now ride away and we'll call it even." Pike's laughter was harsh and humorless. $300 doesn't cover the humiliation, Morrison. Doesn't cover having the whole town see Clarence Pike backed down by some washed-up ranger. This ends with her back in chains and you in the ground." Jake could see the men spreading out, trying to find positions that would give them clear shots into the canyon, but their movements told him these weren't experienced fighters. They were bullies and thugs, used to intimidating unarmed people, not engaging in serious gunfights. From her hiding place, Sarah called out quietly, "Jake, there's another way out of here. Behind these rocks there's a narrow trail that leads up to the ridge. I can see it clearly from here." Jake considered their options. They could try to shoot their way out, but with Tommy to protect, any extended gunfight was too dangerous. The escape route Sarah had spotted might be their best chance. "Pike!" Jake called again. "Let me make you a counteroffer. I'll give you another $100 to end this here and now. Walk away and everybody goes home alive." "No deal, Morrison. I want the woman and I want you dead. Those are my terms." Jake had expected that answer, but the negotiation had bought him time to study Pike's positioning. The saloon owner had made a tactical error. He was focused entirely on the mouth of the canyon, leaving the higher ground unguarded. "Sarah," Jake whispered, "I need you to take Tommy and start up that trail you spotted. Move quiet and stay low. When you reach the top, wait for me. What about you? I'll be right behind you. But first, I'm going to even the odds a little." Jake had noticed something during his reconnaissance of their campsite. Loose rocks and boulders perched precariously on the canyon walls, held in place by little more than erosion patterns and time. A well-placed shot might start a rock slide that would block the canyon entrance, trapping Pike's men or at least giving Jake and Sarah time to escape. As Sarah began her careful climb with Tommy secured against her chest, Jake took aim at a key boulder about 50 feet above Pike's position. The shot rang out like thunder in the confined space, and for a moment nothing happened. Then, with a rumble that grew to a roar, tons of rock began tumbling down the canyon wall. Pike's men scattered in panic as boulders crashed down around them, blocking the main entrance and separating Pike from half his group. In the confusion, Jake began his own climb up the narrow trail, following Sarah toward the ridge. But Pike wasn't finished. With surprising agility for a large man, he abandoned his horse and began scrambling up the rocks, determined to follow his quarry. One of his men, the thin gunfighter Jake remembered from their first encounter, managed to find another route up the canyon wall. Jake reached the ridge to find Sarah waiting with the horses, which she had somehow managed to lead up the treacherous trail. "How did you—" he began. "My father taught me more than just riding and shooting," she replied with grim satisfaction. "He taught me how to think like a scout." They mounted quickly, but Jake could hear Pike and his remaining man climbing below them. The ridge offered a clear route toward the main road, but it also left them exposed if Pike managed to get a clear shot. As they rode along the ridge, gunfire erupted behind them. Pike had reached the top and was shooting wildly, more in frustration than with any real hope of hitting them at that range. But his companion was a better marksman. A bullet whined past Jake's ear, close enough to part his hair. "There," Sarah pointed ahead to where the ridge curved down toward a wooded valley. "If we can reach those trees, we'll have cover." They spurred their horses to a gallop, racing across the open ground as more shots rang out behind them. Jake could hear Pike shouting curses and threats, his voice growing fainter as the distance increased. They reached the tree line and plunged into the forest, following what appeared to be an old deer trail. For several minutes, they rode hard through the pines, branches whipping at their faces and Tommy crying from the rough motion. Finally, Jake called a halt in a small clearing where they could rest and assess their situation. Sarah dismounted and immediately began checking Tommy, who had been remarkably good-natured through the entire ordeal. "He's fine," she reported with relief. "Scared but not hurt." Jake listened carefully for sounds of pursuit, but heard nothing except normal forest noises. "I think we lost them, at least for now. But Pike won't give up easily." "No, he won't." Sarah's voice was thoughtful. "Jake, I need to tell you something else. Pike wasn't just interested in me because of David's debt. Jake studied her face, sensing another revelation. What do you mean? Before David died, he discovered something. Pike's been cheating at cards, using marked decks, employing Confederates in the crowd, rigging games to fleece travelers passing through. David found out and threatened to expose him unless Pike forgave the debt. That's why Pike had him killed. Yes, and David told me where he hid the evidence. Marked cards, witness statements, records of Pike's profits. It's hidden in Sacramento, in a bank vault that only I can access. Jake felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. So this isn't really about $300 or wounded pride. Pike's been running a criminal operation, and you're the only person who can prove it. Sarah nodded grimly. If that evidence reaches the territorial authorities, Pike will hang. He can't afford to let us reach Sacramento. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of hoofbeats reached them through the trees. Pike had managed to find their trail, and he was getting closer. Jake made a decision that surprised even himself. Sarah, take Tommy and keep riding toward Sacramento. Follow the main road from here. It's safer, and you'll make better time. What about you? Jake checked his rifle and pistol, his expression grim but determined. I'm going to end this. Pike's never going to stop hunting us, and you can't spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. Jake, no, there are too many of them. Jake smiled, but there was no humor in it. Only the cold calculation of a man who had made peace with what needed to be done. Maybe, but I've got advantages they don't. I know these mountains. I'm a better shot than any of them, and most importantly, I'm fighting for something that matters. Sarah reached out and took his hand. You've already done more than anyone could ask. You freed us. You've protected us. You don't have to die for us too. I'm not planning on dying, Sarah. I'm planning on living, really living for the first time in years, but to do that I need to finish what we started in Red Creek. The sound of hoofbeats was getting closer. Jake could hear Pike's voice shouting orders to his men, organizing them for a final assault. Go, Jake said firmly. Ride hard and don't look back. Get that evidence to the authorities and make sure Pike pays for what he's done. Give Tommy a good life, and remember that sometimes good people do exist in this world. Sarah leaned over and kissed his cheek gently. Thank you, Jake Morrison, for everything. As Sarah disappeared into the forest with Tommy, Jake took up position behind a fallen log and prepared for what might be his final fight. But for the first time in years, he felt truly alive. He had found his purpose, protected the innocent, and stood up for what was right. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, and Jake Morrison, former Arizona Ranger and reluctant hero, smiled as he chambered around and prepared to meet his destiny. Behind him, fading into the distance, he could hear the sound of Sarah's horse carrying her and Tommy towards safety, toward Sacramento, toward a new life free from the chains of the past. Whatever happened next, Jake Morrison had finally found something worth fighting for.